Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, Identifying Supplies and Shaping Your Team. This is the third in a six-part series that we're offering on emergency preparedness and response. And it's brought to you by the Florida Association of Museums Foundation and Florida Humanities. I want to thank our partners, Florida Humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities, FEMA's Heritage Emergency National Task Force, the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, the Florida Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, Visit Florida, Cure Collections Care, Florida Museum, and the Society of Florida Archivists. Funding for this program is provided by a grant from Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. My name is Carmen Godwin. I'm the FAM Foundation Program Manager. Also on the line is Caroline Tharp-Weiss, who's our Membership and Financial Manager. She's helping with some tech issues. The webinar today is being recorded. The agenda has several different segments. First, we have our speaker has two segments, one on identifying supplies and one on shaping your team. After each of those segments, we will have an open Q&A session. However, if you think of something as our speaker is talking, feel free to go ahead and put that in the chat box, your question at any time during the presentation, and I will make sure that your question gets answered. Or if you'd like to wait for the Q&A session, we can just have you unmute yourself and then you can ask the question directly to our speaker. We also have two breakout sessions. We'll go over in more detail what that means if you haven't participated in one before, but essentially it's an opportunity for you to get together with some of your colleagues and kind of talk through some of these issues that we're talking about today. I will be providing a resource link to multiple resources in the chat box. You can copy the chat box and save that for later, but all those links will be in there for you to reference at a later time. And then finally, we do have a survey that we'll be sending you in an email follow-up. It will only take 3 minutes to complete this survey, and it really helps us understand not only what you thought about the program today, but what types of programs you would like to see the Florida Association of Museums Foundation offer in the future. We do use those, the feedback that we get from those surveys to create the programming each year. So we hope that you will complete that for us when we're finished. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Elise Lecomte is the Registrar and Coordinator of Health and Safety for the Florida Museum of Natural History. She currently serves as an AAM MAP and Accreditation Reviewer, the ARC Secretary, and the SEMC Council Member and Career Center Coordinator. She served as a Collections Manager, Exhibit Registrar, and Conservation Technician for museums in Florida. And she's been a presenter for our workshops, our webinars, and our annual conference when we've been able to have it. We are very happy to have Elise here today with her experience and expertise to share with us on these two topics. So on that note, I'm gonna pass this over to Elise.
Thank you, Carmen, and welcome everyone. I'm gonna share my screen, get the right presentation up here. Welcome everyone. I'm happy to be here and to share some of the information on these two topics with you all today. An up-to-date and adequate supply of emergency response and recovery materials and appropriate equipment can mean the difference between minimal or no damage to the institution and complete disaster. Emergency response and recovery can be broken down into several major stages: preparation, post-emergency cleanup, post-emergency recovery of institutional elements such as collections, exhibit components, administrative offices and files, and technical equipment like computers, and care and maintenance of people during the recovery stage. Different types of supplies and equipment will be needed for each stage of the response and recovery process. As with all other aspects of emergency planning, it is important to identify and gather the necessary supplies and equipment long before an emergency is imminent, or worse, after it happens. The first step is to figure out what you need. Based on the particular threats identified in your institution's risk assessment, identify which emergency supplies and equipment you will need. For example, if the institution is located in a floodplain, clothing such as rubber boots and raincoats, as well as plastic sheeting, sandbags, pumping devices, mops, buckets, squeegees, fans, and dehumidifiers should be kept on hand. For fires, keep an adequate number of fire extinguishers on hand and store buckets, shovels, rakes, and hose. Determine what quantities you will need. How much plastic sheeting will you need to adequately cover all of your collection shelving racks? Will 2 ladders or 4 hammers be enough during an emergency? Identify sources for expensive equipment that you may not be able to buy, such as generators and refrigerated trucks, and make arrangements well in advance for payment and delivery. You may be able to borrow emergency equipment from local emergency authorities, such as barricades, tarps, tents, drying or pumping equipment, or auxiliary lighting. Remember, however, that you will be on your own in a big event that affects the entire area. Identify nearby sources for the replacement of damaged or inaccessible material previously assembled. Create a shopping list and make sure that several members keep a copy of the list off-site. There are many emergency preparedness resources available to help you determine what you might need. The reference, Getty's Building an Emergency Plan, has several comprehensive lists of emergency supplies and equipment. For example, Appendix E provides a list of supplies and equipment needed for a first aid box, an emergency response cart, and a disaster supply box. Steal This Handbook, a publication by the Southeastern Registrars Association, is another good reference. Several of the websites, such as the Northeast Documents Conservation Center, the National Park Service Conservograms, and FEMA have good supply and equipment lists. One note though here, I will say that some of the sites that you might find provide lists, but they're for family preparation and for preparing your home. And these lists aren't always what you need for the museum. A basic supply equipment list includes the following: hand carts, heavy-duty plastic sheeting, polyethylene bags, sponges, absorbent towels, buckets, mops, brooms, wet-dry vacuums, fire extinguishers, flashlights, battery-operated radios, cameras, extra batteries, crowbars, shovels, lumber, first aid supplies, protective clothing like gloves, disposable masks, disposable coveralls, boots, and hard hats, food supplies, and they need to be enough for several days, potable water, and the estimate is 3 days supply at 1 gallon per person per day, and paper goods like toilet paper, enough for several days. And when I first gave this a presentation a while back, toilet paper wasn't such an issue as it became last year. Such cultural institutions, or some cultural institutions, have many different divisions and departments, including the collections department, the exhibits department, education and public programs, facilities and maintenance, security and administration, among others. These different divisions and departments have different needs for emergency response and recovery. Therefore, they will need different types of supplies and equipment for the response and recovery process. Personnel in each of these divisions or departments should assist in identifying and procuring the supplies and equipment needed for this particular division or department. Once you have identified the kinds of supplies and types of equipment you need, determine what the institution already has on hand. Create an inventory of what is already available. Then decide what you need to purchase. Expendable supplies like plastic sheeting and absorbent towels should be designated specifically for emergency response and recovery. If you have these supplies on hand already, but you need to use them for non-emergency related activities, go out and buy another set for emergency use only. Of course, your institution does not have to have two separate sets of equipment, like wet-dry vacuums, chainsaws, ladders, and hand tools. However, these items must be kept in readiness at all times. That is, they have to be inventoried, inspected, and maintained on a regular basis, say monthly, quarterly, or annually. It is also important to include copies of operating manuals and instructions for any special equipment like communication devices such as walkie-talkies or radios, or power equipment such as chainsaws. Better yet, include annual training in the use of such devices, especially fire extinguishers. For dangerous equipment like chainsaws, designate exactly which staff members have the authorization to operate such machinery. Volunteers should not be allowed to operate such equipment without first signing a waiver. Large quantities of expensive items like generators or perishable materials like food and water need not be stockpiled. Instead, identify suppliers and make arrangements for emergency delivery as needed. Now, there are available commercially prepared emergency supply boxes. One is called a Be Ready Recovery Kit, and another is called just a recovery kit. And these are available from archival supply companies like Gaylord and Hollinger Metal Edge. Such kits can also be purchased from other companies as well, such as Fisher Scientific and the Associated Bag Company. The polypropylene box in which Gaylord's Be Ready Recovery Kit contents are stored is similar to their corrugated polypropylene record storage carton. The polypropylene box in which Hollinger's Recovery Kit is stored is also sold separately without the contents. This box used to be called the Rescue Cube or the Res Cube, and you may find reference to that in older articles and resources. Hollinger's Recovery Kit comes prepackaged with a number of useful emergency supplies, including personal protective gear, cleanup equipment like a mop, paper towels, and sponges, plastic sheeting, adhesive tape, caution tape, flashlight and batteries, trash bags, ties, clipboards, paper, index cards, pencils, and a China marker. The pros to a prepackaged supply box are its convenience, ready accessibility, and ease of use. Everything comes in one box. The box is already labeled as an emergency supply box. It is easily stored. The supplies are well protected within the plastic box, which has a reinforced bottom, breathing holes, and comes with 3 nylon 14-inch cable ties to keep it tightly closed. The cons are the high cost and the limited amount of certain supplies. Hollinger's Recovery Kit costs $233 before tax and shipping and handling. Smaller institutions may not be able to afford even one recovery kit. One recovery kit may not be enough. The amount of certain supplies contained in one cube may not be adequate. For example, the recovery kit includes only 2 pre-cut 4 mil plastic sheets of 3 feet by 10 feet and 2 pre-cut 4 mil plastic sheets of 3 feet by 15 feet. And this would not even begin to cover the shelving units in even the smallest collection storage room at the Florida Museum of Natural History. This means that we would have to purchase additional supplies or multiple recovery kits. The amount of needed emergency supplies and equipment may be purchased more cheaply than buying multiple commercial kits. Most of the supplies in the commercial kits can be purchased more cheaply if bought separately. Some, like the plastic sheeting, can be purchased in bulk for discounted prices, then shared by several divisions or departments within a larger institution or by smaller institutions within the same local area. Many institutions assemble their own kits. Kits made in-house are usually more cost-effective, comprehensive, and personalized to the institution. The advantage of making up your own kits are that you can purchase cheaper storage containers, buy the number of supplies and pieces of equipment that you need, and buy certain supplies like gloves, disposable masks, disposable coveralls, paper towels, plastic sheeting in bulk at discount prices. Establish designated locations to share your emergency supplies and equipment. These areas can be anything from a couple of shelves on a storage rack, a couple of shelves or drawers in a cabinet, or a corner of a storage room or closet. Label the supplies clearly and mark the locations with highly visible signage, for example, with brightly colored paper or poster board. The Florida Museum of Natural History uses indelible markers to mark supply containers and brightly colored paper signs to indicate supply and equipment locations. The Seattle Museum keeps supplies in large crates painted bright yellow to visually orient staff to the supply caches. Choose the locations carefully. The supplies and equipment need to be easily and quickly accessible. It is important to provide sufficient protection for supplies and equipment so that they will be available and undamaged in the event of a disaster. For example, storing absorbent towels and other dry goods in cardboard boxes in a flimsy metal storage shed when your institution is susceptible to hurricanes or flooding is not a good idea. In this instance, chances are great that the shed, the boxes, and the supplies will be damaged or destroyed during the disaster. Post maps that alert staff members as to where they can find emergency supplies and equipment, such as designated cleaning supplies, fire extinguishers, and keys to emergency supply equipment storage areas. It is important to make sure that all staff, including volunteers, know exactly where emergency supply caches and equipment are located and who has access to them, including who keeps the keys to the cabinet, closet, or storeroom. There is nothing worse than not knowing where the wet dry vacuum is stored or not being able to get to it when water is cascading down the front of a collection storage cabinet. It is essential to inventory caches of emergency supplies and inspect emergency equipment on a regular basis. It does you no good to have identified and gathered these items if they have disappeared or are non-functional when you need them. Using a pre-emergency prepared checklist, inventory the supplies. Replace any that are missing and replenish any that are depleted. Repair or replace any broken or missing tools and machinery. Check to see if any equipment needs batteries or chargers. Are the batteries installed? Do you have extra batteries? How old are they? What is the source of power for battery chargers? Some emergency chargers are now solar powered. For example, the Econ emergency radio has a solar powered cell phone jack. Our first aid kits well stocked. This is an example of a pre-emergency prepared checklist from the National Park Service Conservagram number 21/2, an emergency cart for salvaging water damaged objects. It is available as a PDF on the website shown on this slide. Of course, it should be modified to fit your institution's individual emergency supply and equipment needs. Establish a regular schedule, monthly, quarterly, annually, and stick to it. One of the things that we do at the Florida Museum is to inventory and check our emergency supplies in early May before the hurricane season starts. A good time to check emergency supplies and equipment is during the annual review of your emergency preparedness plan or before drills. At the same time, verify that outside experts and/or resource information is up to date. Designate one person, such as a member of the Health and Safety Committee, or a team of people, for example, a member from each of the institution's divisions or departments, to be responsible for the regular inventories and inspection of emergency supplies and equipment. At the Florida Museum, our facilities manager tests our battery-operated emergency lights monthly. Our fire extinguishers are inspected monthly by staff from the university's Department of Environmental Health and Safety. Replace batteries in emergency equipment such as flashlights and radios on a regular schedule. One of the things that I've been noticing recently is no matter what the deadline or the expiration date is on the batteries, if they're left long enough, they start to leak the battery acid, even though the expiration date hasn't come yet. So I am checking our batteries much more frequently than I used to. Using the same schedule that we all use to replace the batteries in our smoke alarms, that is the dates of the spring and fall time changes, will make it easy for you to remember. Make sure to replenish supplies and clean or repair equipment as soon as possible after a drill or an actual recovery operation. The institution's annual budget should include line items for the purchase, maintenance, or replacement of emergency supplies and equipment. At the Mystic Seaport Museum, each department is responsible for including these costs in their annual department budget. At the Florida Museum, the director's office budgets annually for these expenses with input from the museum's Health and Safety Committee. One of my responsibilities as chair of the Health and Safety Committee, again in early May, I send an email around to all of our collections managers, lab directors, heads of departments, asking what emergency supplies they need to be replaced or to be purchased. And then I am responsible for compiling a complete list and for purchasing and distributing those emergency supplies. Unless an emergency situation occurs to deplete supplies, maintenance costs should be minimal. Establish a credit line with vendors ahead of time to be used in the event of an emergency, for example, with hardware stores, office supply stores, or disaster recovery firms, so that supplies can be procured and services obtained even if there is no way to pay for them up front. Remember, credit cards cannot be processed in the event of a power outage. The institution may have to fundraise to meet certain emergency supplies and equipment needs. This could be one of the board's responsibilities. Institutional and community members may be willing to donate funds for such expenses. They would rather give for emergency preparedness than wait to hear from us when we are totally devastated and needing tens of thousands of dollars. Do not be afraid to solicit donations from local businesses and corporations. They may be willing to donate goods or arrange for post-disaster recovery services. Drugstores and grocery stores may be willing to help stock emergency supply storage containers. Office supply stores may donate heavy-duty boxes for moving the collection. A lumber company may supply and cut wood for protective shutters. Some institutional insurance policies may cover the purchase or rental of emergency response and recovery supplies and equipment, for example, portable generators, temporary relocation costs, and cleanup services. We have a moving company in Gainesville that we work with on a regular basis, and they are very quick to respond to our needs when we need to move a collection or when we need to get supplies for preparation and cleanup from an emergency. Some institutional insurance policies, I read that. The policy should cover drying, cleaning, and reconditioning of equipment and collections objects. Keep copies of the insurance claim with emergency supplies on site and with copies of other important documents off site. Make sure that someone on staff other than the director or finance manager has access to cash and credit in the case of an emergency. A real emergency for the Seattle Museum revealed a financial oversight in its emergency preparedness plan. The downtown Seattle area experienced a major power outage, which could have placed sensitive museum artifacts in jeopardy. Diesel was low in the emergency generator, and the museum was in danger of running out of fuel. Staff had to arrange an emergency delivery of fuel early on a Saturday morning. They realized that they did not have access to cash or to a company credit card to pay for it. The senior deputy director used her own credit card to pay for it. The museum has since made arrangements with the diesel company, and they will accept museum charges on a company credit card. Also, the senior deputy director now has authorization to use the museum's credit card. In addition, the museum now has the emergency generator refueled immediately following routine testing. These are just a few details to think about concerning emergency response and recovery supplies and equipment. Does anybody have any questions or comments? And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
So if you have any questions, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself now and ask Elise, or if you're shy, you can type it in the chat box. Anybody have any questions about supplies?
Hi, yes, I have a question. My name is Anna Juarez. I was wondering, what's the, we're talking about plastic sheeting to cover, for example, stacks or maybe large paintings or something. Is there a best kind of material for that, or is it just a heavy kind of sheeting?
If possible, it should be polyethylene, and most of the plastic sheeting that's now available in Home Depot, Lowe's, hardware stores is polyethylene. You want to get more of a heavy duty plastic, not the most flimsy. It's available almost any place now. It's very easy to get. I noticed when I got some last year in preparation, it's gotten a little expensive, but it's well worth the expense. And we don't have to replace those rolls very often because when we cut sheets to cover certain pieces of equipment, shelving units, cabinets, we label them, and when the emergency is over, we put them away in boxes and mark the boxes. So we use those year after year. We did have to replace some this year because the plastic does deteriorate over time and start to break up.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Anna. Anybody else have any questions at this time? Okay, if you think of anything, please feel free to type it in the chat box. Elise, do we want to move on to the breakout question? Can you share that?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we've got groups of 3 to 4 people. We're going to give you about 10 minutes to think about this question, and then and talk to your colleagues about it in your particular room. So the breakout question is, does your organization have a supply cart or container? That's an easy one. What are the 10 most important things for your organization to include in your particular cart or container? And then, do you think you need an offsite backpack? If so, what items should go in that? So just kind of talk through that with your group. The person whose birthday is closest to today should be the scribe of your group, or the person to take notes for your group. I encourage you to unmute yourself and to turn on your camera so that you can interact with your colleagues. And then we'll call you back in about 10 minutes. And also record your room number. There's 5 rooms. So when you get in, make sure you write down which room number you're in. So I'm going to open the rooms now, and I will copy and paste this question so that you have it when you enter the room. So how it ended up working out was we ended up having just 3 breakout groups. I ended up having to move a few people around. So I'm going to ask groups 1, 3, and 5 to just give us like a short overview of what you guys discussed. Hopefully you wrote down your group number. Group number 1 had Carlos, Ellery, Griselle, and Thomas. Can one of you report back to us?
Hi, this is Griselle from the IMAG History and Science Center in Fort Myers. So we spoke about quite a few things. One thing that we'd like to have, or that we all have, we don't have our carts yet, but we have our supplies that we've learned to keep on hand after a planned disaster. Thomas at the Everglades, the Museum of the Everglades during Irma took on a lot of water. And they have historic buildings with historic wood floors. And when their water was shut off, they had the issue of not being able to clean their floors that were full of mud. And so from that, he's learned to keep some 5-gallon buckets of water on hand with squeegees and those supplies on hand. So that's something they learned about. And then we also discussed having emergencies that aren't planned. We just recently at our museum had pipe burst. And so from that, and it was during the day while we had guests at the museum, we since then have installed a sensor that will detect when there are leaks on any of our exhibits that have plumbing directly to it, so that we get a text message, whether it's in the middle of the night or during the day. And then from that, we bring out our supplies like our fans or our rags, our shot backs that we had to then hurry and scrounge up. I think now we know to have that in a set place. So if there is ever a big leak or a disaster like that, that we have those items on hand.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Griselle. I appreciate that. And then group 3, which was Alicia, Jean, who joined a little bit late, Sarah, and Syra, thank you, and
No
Shelby.
We mostly ended up really talking about we're from very different institutions of very different sizes, and so we ended up talking a bit about the way organization around disaster response kind of changes based on the size of your institution, and to a certain extent the way we've had to change some of what we do to accommodate shutdowns and people working from home and things like that. So that we used to have, for instance, Alicia and I are both from the Minnesota Historical Society, and we had floor monitors who would be responsible for, say, evacuating certain areas and things like that. And with the shutdown, it's been harder to tell who's going to be in when and for how long, because everyone's schedules have kind of shifted a little to only be in when they absolutely need to be in. Yeah, so we ended up kind of going on tangents, kind of not quite along the line of supplies, but I think it was a really interesting and kind of useful discussion.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I think that often happens when we break out into the groups and we start talking, especially when we haven't had an opportunity to talk in a while to our colleagues. But that is an important issue. We have an emergency that we're responding to, which is the pandemic. And then if you have another emergency that you're responding to at the same time, you're going to kind of need to change how you react to that. So I think that's a good point. And then group number 5 is Anna, Brent, Jason, and Meg.
Hi, yeah. So most of the group did have supply carts and supplies ready to go. Meg talked about having really multiple around and that being a good idea. And then Jason talked about how, you know, there's an offsite, he has offsite to worry about. And so there's another cart or pack left there. In terms of the most important things to have, I said plastic sheeting, and then Meg talked about actually something really neat, tarps and magnets and clothespins. So I hadn't considered magnets, and really just looking around and thinking about how many things I could hang with magnets. I thought that was really neat. Jason talked about ratchet straps and having twine, and even, you know, duct tape can do a lot of really neat things for us. And then Brent talked about flashlights, and then we went and we kind of just then give headlamps a lot of time, because I think headlamps are the best thing, and you can kind of have your hands free and do a lot more when you have a headlamp on. And then in terms of the last question of having an offsite backpack, Meg has something really neat. She just has a Go Pack ready in her office. And Jason again talked about the importance of those archival records and having those backed up, and maybe having just that all figured out before an emergency happens.
Those are all really great points and tips. Thank you guys so much for participating in that. I'm going to let Elise move on to the next section on sort of building your team. And then we'll have another Q&A. But again, if you have any questions throughout, please feel free to type those in the chat box, and we'll make sure to get those answered. Or you can ask them at the next Q&A session that we have.
Before we move on, Carmen, I have just a couple of comments from the breakout discussion. Griselle mentioned sensors, and those are really important. We have a lot of freezers with genetic tissue samples, with animal skins, and so we also have sensors on our freezers that are linked to our phones and can let us know if they go out. Syra talked about, in her group, people working from home. In that situation, and the situation that we've had with the pandemic, it's important to appoint what we call essential personnel, those people who have authorization to go into the buildings, into the facilities, at times when other people aren't allowed in, during emergencies, if the building has been cleared. So that was one of my jobs. I actually worked quite a bit during the pandemic from my office to keep a check on everything. And then those headlamps are great. Anna and her group, they're really cheap now too. And so they're a good thing to have on hand. One of the things that I did not mention and should have is that a copy of your emergency plan and your contact lists, your person and resource contact list, should be kept in your emergency containers, your carts or your buckets, and in the offsite backpack as well. That's one of the things that some of us keep that stuff in our cars, some keep at home, but most of us that are working with health and safety have copies offsite. Okay, so I'm going to move on now. I have to stop sharing this and share the next presentation. All right, so in this presentation, there's a lot of information that I'm going to share with you. It may be a little bit overwhelming, but I will refer to that periodically throughout. It's sometimes not an easy thing to do to put teams together. So I'm hoping that the information that I present today will be helpful to you. Many institutions have created teams to carry out preparedness measures and to lead emergency response and recovery activities. The team approach helps to maximize the use of specialized skills. It places people in the roles best suited to their abilities and personality. The number and types of teams will depend on the size and organization of your institution. We will explore how to assemble teams for emergency preparedness and response and recovery activities, and who the key players might be. I will also add that when I'm finished and during the question and answer period, I will post my email in the chat box. And if anyone has questions or needs additional information after the webinar is over, please feel free to contact me via email. When putting teams together, keep these guidelines in mind. Each team should have a leader and at least one backup leader. Smaller teams may operate more efficiently because communications sometimes break down in larger groups. Each team member should be assigned responsibilities and be capable of carrying out these responsibilities. Special emphasis should be placed on training members to handle their designated responsibilities. Select members based on skill, knowledge, and attitudes. Select team members on the basis of 3 categories of skill: technical and functional, problem solving, and interpersonal. Designate the chain of command, making sure each team member knows to whom they report and whom they supervise, if anyone. Oops. All efforts at team building should focus on the process and on accomplishing the intended tasks. One way to foster commitment is to involve as many people as possible in the emergency preparedness and response program. Identifying true believers in emergency preparedness and inviting them onto the team helps craft the proper atmosphere. Be clear about expectations of the team. If goals and rules are not focused, neither will be the team's work. Exploit the power of positive feedback, recognition, and reward. Positive reinforcement works as well in a team context as it does elsewhere, as long as it is genuine and sincere. Do not overlook other personnel who are on hand regularly, such as docents or guides, volunteers, custodians, contract security officers, and contract laborers. These individuals may be able to provide support in any emergency rescue operation. And sometimes they are the people that are in the building or on site when an emergency occurs. They may be the only people there. By becoming involved, they will also be better informed in the event of an emergency. Colleagues from other institutions, organizations, or agencies may also be a resource if willing and trained. Designate a number of alternates in a line of succession to fill each role should the primary appointee be unavailable. This flexibility is crucial since no one knows when an emergency will strike or who will be in the building at the time. How many positions you assign in the line of succession will depend on certain skills, on how important certain skills are to the role. For example, if it is critical to have a person with engineering experience directing the buildings and maintenance response team, it would be advisable to designate a number of backups for the team leader. For sandbagging and boarding up windows, most people can fill the position if they have some training and are physically capable. Include the roles and responsibilities of each team position in the emergency preparedness and response plan. Give each team member a job title that accurately describes the chief function, duties, and responsibilities of the job. For instance, teams and team members may be assigned to the areas of salvage, stabilization, and supplies. Note that more than one team member may have the same job title. Roles and responsibilities as a particular job may require more than one person to accomplish. In addition to familiarizing people with their role, putting it in writing makes it easier for an alternate to run down the checklist of work to be carried out. This will help keep the emergency preparation and recovery on track. The first team to be developed is the one responsible for creating the emergency preparedness and response plan, hereafter the emergency plan. The committee should be broad-based and should therefore include senior administrators and representatives from every key division or department of your institution. Depending on the size and focus of your institution, these divisions or departments may include some or all of the following: administration, computer systems, collections, conservation, exhibits, security, buildings and maintenance, public relations, library, and volunteer resources. Experts in corporate team building recommend selecting members based on skill and potential, not personality. 3 categories of skill are key to the success of the committee: technical and functional, problem solving, and interpersonal. Include at least a few true believers, that is, employees who believe strongly in emergency preparedness, and whenever possible, employees who have previous experience in emergency preparedness or related areas. The head of the Emergency Planning Committee is the Emergency Preparedness Manager, the Emergency Planning Manager. This can be any staff member from your organization, as long as that person is a strong leader. For example, this person can be the chair of the Health and Safety Committee, the director, the facilities manager or building supervisor, or the head of collections. The EPM must have the tenacity to guide the committee through the long and sometimes tedious process of creating an emergency plan. The EPM should have solid administrative skills, be familiar with the institution's various divisions or departments and collections, and have knowledge of all potential threats and disasters. The EPM is responsible for leading the Emergency Planning Committee through the process of gathering information needed to write an emergency plan, working with the director to designate an emergency response coordinator and alternates for the position. And we will discuss the position of emergency response coordinator in just a minute. They chair the Emergency Planning Committee. They work with the Emergency Planning Committee to launch a training program that helps staff members address fears associated with emergency preparedness and provides them with the skills they need in a crisis. They're responsible for keeping the director and board up to date on the committee's progress and involving outside service agencies such as state, regional, and local emergency management agencies, local CERT, that is community emergency response teams, and local police and fire departments. The EPM is in charge of the following 6 tasks: contact others for advice and support, designate responsibility and provide support, appoint division or department preparedness teams, appoint a communications coordinator, organize and conduct staff drills, and hold post-mortem review meetings after a disaster occurs. Next, an emergency response coordinator should be selected. The ERC takes charge in an actual emergency, coordinating all response and recovery activities. This position requires calmness in the face of calamity and a thorough understanding of the emergency plan. The ERC should be given broad authority in the event of a disaster, such as the ability to dispense petty cash or authorize expenditures. In some cases, one person may have the skills to serve as both emergency planning manager and emergency response coordinator. It is important to appoint and train at least one backup person for the EPM and ERC roles. In fact, any staff member may find him or herself in the position of being the first person on site to handle an emergency, and thus should know what is expected. That is why involvement of all staff in the planning process is crucial. And that person who finds himself as the first person on site, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to take over the role of the emergency response coordinator. It means that they do have to know how to contact that person or their alternate to get them to the site. The ERC is responsible for working with the emergency planning manager, the emergency planning committee, and team leaders to select response teams. Implementing preventive or preparedness measures as recommended by division or departmental teams. Setting up and running the emergency command center during a disaster. The ERC is in charge of the following 4 tasks. Declares the emergency plan operational when necessary, directs all operations when the institution is in emergency status, continues to assess the emergency accurately, its progress, potential damage, and responses, and commands the staff based on these assessments, and determines cessation of the state of emergency. One team position that is very important but that is often overlooked is that of communications coordinator. The communications coordinator serves as a spokesperson for the museum during and after an emergency to answer questions, to offer information to the public, and to obtain external information as needed during an emergency. Having a communications coordinator significantly reduces the confusion that often arises during and after emergencies and improves the consistency and accuracy of released information. This person and this person only deals with the media in order to avoid conflicting messages from the institution, inaccurate information, and negative publicity. Everyone working on the emergency response should be instructed to refer all media questions to the communications coordinator. The communications coordinator works closely with the director during an emergency, reporting directly to the emergency response coordinator. A high priority should be placed on keeping the coordinator, the communications coordinator, fully informed and up to date on events. Various staff members within your institution will have the skill to fill this position, such as the public relations director, who is familiar with all aspects of the institution's functions and is accustomed to dealing with the media. The director or a media savvy member of the board. I caution against assigning this role to the emergency planning manager because that person will be extremely busy with other responsibilities, as will the emergency response coordinator. The communications coordinator is responsible for gathering and coordinating information for dissemination through the media, gathering and disseminating information from external sources, such as the extent of the emergency that is not localized to the institution, assessing the accuracy of the information, keeping staff, visitors, and the community informed. And the community includes civic groups, such as the local convention and visitors bureau, scheduled group tour organizers, and paid tour guides. Being accessible to the media and maintaining control of their activities. Coordinating news releases with investigating agencies such as the emergency management agencies and fire and police departments. Communicating early on with insurance agents, lawyers if necessary, and the board. Refraining from making decisions or stating opinions on controversial or questionable topics unless these have been previously discussed with the director. Setting up a communications and public relations post and being on site following an emergency. Keeping a log of all media information that has been released. What was released, when, and to whom. Soliciting public support. The communications coordinator is in charge of the following 6 tasks. Focus on building team communications, establish communication procedures, both internal and external, to follow during and after an emergency, equip the preparedness teams with the proper information, update staff, including volunteers, on the progress, cultivate contacts with outside agencies, and utilize the media. The resource, Building an Emergency Plan, a guide for museums and other cultural institutions, published as a PDF by the Getty Conservation Institute. And this is in the resource list along with the website where it can be downloaded. This publication describes 4 teams that are useful to put together for emergency preparedness and response. The safety and security team, the collections team, the buildings and maintenance team, and the administration records team. Each of these teams consists of 2 sub-teams, a preparedness team and a response team, members of which may be the same or different. This may seem daunting at first to those of you from institutions with a small staff. However, it is possible to adapt the concepts presented here to fit your institution. In some cases, staff members can serve on multiple teams. During the planning process, it is easy for planning team members to serve multiple roles. For example, when drafting the emergency plan, one person may be responsible for writing the sections on security and safety, as well as on buildings and maintenance. During emergency response, it may be necessary to have additional members on the teams. And this is a time when the institution board members and volunteers and colleagues from other institutions, organizations, and agencies may be called on to help. The primary responsibility of the safety and security team is to save lives and prevent or reduce injury. The team does this by creating and implementing a system of rules and practices that make the museum less vulnerable to accidents and better equipped to respond to an emergency. The team thoroughly evaluates the safety and security procedures currently in place, identifies where the institution is vulnerable, and produces 2 reports for the Emergency Preparedness Committee. A vulnerability and asset analysis that recommends preparedness and protection measures, that is, what should be done to prevent the loss of human life in the event of an emergency, and to reduce damage to the security aspect of the institution's functions. And 2, an outline of response procedures and techniques, including the role of the safety and security response team during an emergency. It should include a list of equipment and supplies needed, as well as a list of any hazardous materials stored on site. It is important to note that saving the collections is not this team's top priority. That's often misunderstood among team members of the various teams. The safety and security team is in charge of the following 18 tasks. As part of the vulnerability and asset analysis, conduct a security survey, evaluate the security force, evaluate the inventory systems, evaluate the monitoring of people, evaluate equipment needs, invite local agencies and individuals to participate, recommend security-related protective measures. As part of the outline of response procedures and techniques, identify potential temporary bases of operations, identify potential safe rooms and/or outside shelters, determine emergency evacuation routes, develop the safety and security response team, develop emergency procedures, detail recovery procedures, create lists of staff and resource contact information, create fact sheets and maps, stock emergency supplies and equipment, establish routines to keep the plan viable, and identify and implement appropriate training. The safety and security team collaborates with the other 3 teams by assisting with the following activities. In collections, setting guidelines for relocating or evacuating objects and identifying emergency shelters. With buildings and maintenance, establishing evacuation routes for people, establishing evacuation routes for collections, determining preventive building maintenance, identifying and preparing emergency shelters, and housekeeping in collaboration with the collections team. With the administration and records team, setting guidelines for relocation or evacuation, resolving administrative and legal issues regarding relocating and evacuating people and property, and documenting activities. Before I move on to the other teams, I'd like to stress that these teams do not have to be large. They can be 2 people. I don't suggest that they're just 1 person, if at all possible, because collaboration among at least 2 people is always helpful in completing these tasks and fulfilling the responsibilities of each team. The job of the collections team is to evaluate the collections thoroughly to determine where the institution is vulnerable and what to do during an emergency. The team produces 2 reports for the Emergency Preparedness Committee. 1, a vulnerability and asset analysis that identifies the collections vulnerability to damage and recommends measures for preventing damage. And 2, an outline of recommended procedures and techniques for evacuating, salvaging, and recovering prioritized objects and the role of the collections response team. The collections team is in charge of the following 15 tasks. As part of the vulnerability and asset analysis, and if you'll recall, this can also be called the risk assessment, which is part of the discussion of which was part of the first webinar of this series. So the collections team looks at the collections with a fresh eye. They assess the risks of damage. They evaluate documentation and inventory systems. They invite local agencies and individuals to participate, set priorities for the collections, and recommend preventive measures. As part of the outline of recommended procedures and techniques, identify potential safe rooms and/or outside shelters. Develop the collections response team. Set guidelines for moving objects. Detail recovery procedures. Create lists of staff and resource contact information. Create fact sheets and maps. Stock emergency supplies and equipment. Establish routines to keep the plan viable, and identify and implement appropriate training. The collections team collaborates with the other 3 teams by assisting with the following activities. With the safety and security team, the security of emergency shelters. screening of volunteers to help in evacuation or emergency salvage, security of the building if there is structural damage, and security of the collections in the event of relocation or evacuation. With buildings and maintenance, places to store cultural objects. Preventive building maintenance, housekeeping practices, secondary storage sites, and evacuation routes for collections. With the administration and records team, collections, insurance issues, inventory and intellectual control, and documentation of activities. The job of the buildings and maintenance team is to thoroughly evaluate the building and its systems to determine where the vulnerabilities are and what to do during an emergency. The team produces 2 reports for the Emergency Preparedness Committee: a vulnerability and assets analysis that recommends preparedness and protective measures. That is, what to do to prevent damage to the buildings and by extension to people and collections in an emergency. And 2, an outline of the role of the buildings and maintenance response team during an emergency. It should include lists of repair and service vendors and their contact information, as well as equipment and supplies needed. And it should address training issues pertinent to the team's expertise. The buildings and maintenance team is in charge of the following 13 tasks. As part of the vulnerability and asset analysis, survey the buildings, surroundings, and systems and identify priorities. Evaluate buildings and maintenance staff. Evaluate equipment needs. Invite local agencies and individuals to participate. And recommend building-related protective measures and list priorities. As part of the outline of the role of the building and maintenance response team, identify potential safe rooms and/or outside shelters, develop the buildings and maintenance response team, detail recovery procedures, create lists of staff and resource contact information, create fact sheets, maps, and plans, stock emergency supplies and equipment, establish routines to keep the plan viable, and identify and implement appropriate training. The buildings and maintenance team collaborates with the other 3 teams by assisting with the following activities. With the safety and security team, evacuation routes for people, evacuation routes for collections, safety of emergency shelters, safety of buildings if there is structural damage. With the collections team, location of and requirements for emergency shelters, additional storage requirements, guidelines for relocating and evacuating objects, and housekeeping practices. With the administration and records team, building insurance issues, repair and maintenance record keeping, utilities and environmental systems documentation, and documentation of activities. The job of the administration and records team is to thoroughly evaluate administrative functions and record-keeping systems to determine where the institution is vulnerable, to evaluate personnel and legal issues related to emergency preparedness and response, and to identify their own roles during an emergency. The team produces 2 reports for the Emergency Preparedness Committee. 1, a vulnerability and assets analysis that recommends preparedness and protective measures, including what should be done to prevent damage to institutional administrative functions and to prevent destruction of important data in the event of an emergency. And 2, an outline of the role of the administration and records response team during an emergency. It should include information of service vendors and their telephone numbers, as well as equipment and supplies needed. It should also note training issues pertinent to this area. The administration and records team is in charge of the following 13 tasks. As part of the vulnerability and asset analysis, evaluate record-keeping systems and procedures, anticipate financial and legal concerns, Review insurance coverage and procedures. Evaluate equipment and data safety and needs. Invite local agencies and individuals to participate. Recommend records-related protective measures. As part of the outline of the role of the administration and records response team during an emergency, identify potential temporary operational headquarters. Develop the administration and records response team. Develop recovery procedures. Create lists of staff and resource contact information. Create relevant fact sheets and maps. Stock emergency supplies and equipment. Establish routines to keep the plan viable, and identify and implement appropriate training. The administration and records team collaborates with the other 3 teams by assisting with the following activities. With the safety and security team, evacuation routes for equipment and or non-expendable furniture. Volunteer screening and coordination, security of evacuated data, fire prevention efforts, and temporary operations headquarters. With the collections team, collection insurance issues, volunteer coordination, inventory lists, and documentation of activities. With the building and maintenance team, documentation during relocation or evacuation, repair and maintenance record keeping, volunteer coordination, and building insurance issues. Now, this organizational chart shows the chain of command and divisions of teams with their respective duties. And this again comes from the Building an Emergency Plan publication. Each team consists of a preparedness team and a response team, each of which gathers data on preventive and preparedness measures, response procedures, and recovery procedures. Although the chart shown here is ideal for a large institution with a large staff, and that was this chart, it can be easily adapted to suit a smaller institution with a smaller staff. The Barbados Museum and Historical Society, with a staff of only 26, created an organized structure for response and recovery using only 3 teams: a core team, a disaster team, and a response team. The role of the core team is to secure the museum's collections and records prior to the impending emergency, given adequate notice of the approaching threat. The role of the disaster team after an emergency is to enter the buildings when it is safe to do so and assess the physical condition of the buildings and the collections. The disaster team determines if and how the recovery team will be activated. The role of the recovery team is to survey the facilities and collections and begin to take the appropriate steps for recovery. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of the incident command system. During an emergency, a central base of operations or an emergency command center must be established, from which the response and recovery teams can operate following an evacuation. This is called the Incident Command Center. Once established, the command post should be manned by the emergency response coordinator, often called the incident commander, and the leaders of the response teams. In the second webinar of this series, Building Your Plan, Rebecca Kennedy does an excellent job of explaining what the incident command system is and the role of the incident commander. So I will refer you to the recording of that webinar to learn more about ICS and the role of the incident commander. I'd like to take just a minute to talk about the use of volunteers as team members. In the aftermath of a disaster, the museum may be inundated with well-meaning volunteers eager to help. And what I mean is many of our museums in Florida are actually run by volunteers. However, the volunteers that run that museum have positions like professional paid museum people. So someone may serve as the director, someone may serve as the collections person. But what I'm talking about here are volunteers that may be part of your museum, like docents, collections assistants, but volunteers from the community as well. So the museum may be inundated with well-meaning volunteers eager to help. If the disaster is large enough, you may need outside volunteer assistance. As part of the emergency plan, it is important to develop a system that helps use the skills and energies of these volunteers effectively. Remember that the effectiveness of their assistance depends on the effectiveness of your communication with them. Protecting the Past from Natural Disasters, that is a written publication, offers the following suggestion for working with volunteers. Clarify expectations on each side. Define jobs to be done. Set specific goals, weighing costs against benefits. Persuade volunteers to do needed work that they may not have envisioned, such as answering telephones. Provide recognition for the volunteers' contributions, from public thanks to free lunches if the budget permits. And most importantly, say no to volunteers if you cannot adequately direct them. This is something that is very difficult to do, but is necessary in some situations. Well, that's a rundown on how you might shape emergency preparedness and response teams, and some of the concepts and activities that you need to consider when organizing teams and assigning roles and responsibilities. I hope that I haven't overwhelmed any of you, but regardless of the size of your institution and the number of staff that you have, you can adapt this information to fit your museums. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Again, you can just unmute yourself if you have a question and ask Elise directly, or you can type it into the chat box.
Now, Carmen, since I'm sharing, I can't see the chat box, so you'll have to let me know if there are questions in the chat box.
Yes, I can do that. Anybody have any questions about shaping your team? Okay. I was wondering, Elise, I've mostly worked in small organizations,
right,
meaning, probably 3 or 4 employees. So right, when you have, and heavily relying on volunteers, as you mentioned, volunteer positions, is this just a question of, even if somebody's a volunteer, identifying their strengths to match up with some of these positions?
Yes, that's correct. And I would say with a small museum like that, where you have only 3 or 4 staff members, there may be members of the community that you can bring in when you're putting together the emergency plan, and they are willing to be, so to speak, on call in the case of emergency to help you. They will come in and help you, even though they are not regular staff members there, or they don't regularly work at the museum, because that in a large emergency, you will need a lot more help than 3 people.
Right.
You can certainly put together the emergency plan with the 3 people, but you won't be able to respond to a large emergency with just 3 people.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have any questions? All right, let's move on, Elise, to the breakout session. Okay, if you have any problems this time within your breakout session, you can just come back to the main room, like if there's no one else in there, and I can reassign you to another room. So for this breakout question, we're asking you to consider who at your organization will take on the major roles of emergency response, coordinator, incident commander, recovery team member, and communications coordinator. So those 3 major roles. And, you know, are these different from the roles that they currently play within your organization? And then also consider if you're basing it on their personality and their experience or their current role. And I'm going to copy and paste this once I open up the rooms into the chat box so that you can see the definitions as well. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the rooms again, write down your group number as well as whoever's birthday is closest today to take notes for us. All right, welcome back everyone to the main room. Thank you so much for participating in that. I want to go ahead and open this up to report back. In group 2, we had Jason, Jean, Shelby, and I'm going to butcher it again, Shariah. Is that how you say it? Syra. Okay, thank you.
No worries. So yeah, there was a fair amount of overlap between, I think, all of us, in terms of, I think for several of us, there were people who would, like, we could easily name who would play the various roles. But we also talked about, like, there was a little bit of variation depending on organization size. And of course, that makes a big difference. And also, you know, who lives close by and can get to the institution quicker. You know, maybe having people who live close by kind of, like, that might determine which roles they might take in certain situations.
Okay, great point. And then group number 3, Alicia, Anna with 2 N's, and Ellery.
Hi guys, I'm Anna with 2 N's. I'm in a shared office, so I am going to leave my camera off. But we're going to start with question 1. So in our group, one of our participants is actually basically head of emergencies and incidents at her location. So in her case, she would always be the one like taking lead on the major roles. But in my facility, for example, there are not a lot of employees, and we kind of just jump down if there's an issue and everyone kind of gets together to handle things. Typically, our maintenance department would take the lead on most of the emergency response and the recovery, or even our director, because again, we are a really small facility. So when it comes down to it, we all have to be kind of on hand. And as for communication, we actually have a radio system. So we can just kind of radio to each other at any given time. So communication is really kind of quick in that respect, which is nice. Should we move on to the other questions as well, or just the one?
Sure, go ahead.
So we talked about different roles. Obviously in my museum, I actually am an educator and I help take care of the animals that we have on site. So for example, if I was to be one of the emergency response coordinators or the commander, obviously this would be a very different role from what I would be doing on my day-to-day basis. But we unfortunately have little things happen quite often. So we're all actually pretty well versed in playing these different roles. Whereas I mentioned one of my group members, Alicia, she literally that is her job. She just does emergency response coordinating and commanding all day long. So it's actually the same role that she currently works in, which was really cool to kind of understand her side. And then we barely got to question 3, but we all kind of decided that these choices and ideas were based on mostly experience and our current roles that we play in our museums.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Of course.
And then room 4, we had Griselle, Jason, and Meg.
I think it was just me and Griselle. Jason wasn't in our room, but we just kind of had a general conversation that answered all of these questions kind of at once. So Griselle was talking about how in her organization, a lot of the disaster roles kind of merge with current roles already within the organization. So she's the business manager, kind of making plans, and then maintenance teams and the marketing department reaching out to the public. And so it's kind of a nice flow of personalities and experiences from the daily working life to the disaster response. And within my organization, I'm an archaeologist at the Department of Natural Resources in South Carolina. We've been through multiple disasters. But for us, when we got hit by a flood in 2015 and our whole archive went underwater for 3 days, we only had 3 staff members on our team. So we were running into a scenario where people were wearing multiple hats. Thank goodness now we are divided out amongst 25 staff members and can divide out those tasks. But one of the things that we take very seriously is the safety aspect of things. And so our entire team are certified as wilderness first responders. And we interchange those safety roles, and everybody's looking out for everyone's safety. And we also have within our agency a media department who handles the media and the public outreach. So that's kind of taken out of our team's hands within disaster scenarios. But yeah, so I think for both of us, the daily working lives of our teams and then what we take into the disaster scenarios is kind of interchangeable, both with personalities and experience.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Elise, did you have any follow-up on that?
I did.
Okay, great.
And I'm glad that Syra brought up the issue of where people live, because I had written myself a note before we came back to explain that even though I am head of the Health and Safety Committee, I am not the primary emergency response coordinator because I live 30 minutes or more outside of town. I only have 2 ways to get to Gainesville, and one of those ways is prone to flooding. So, and we have 2 facilities, so 2 main facilities. So our facilities managers are the primary response coordinators. Our associate director is an alternate, and I am an alternate. Now for hurricanes, because of where I live, I come into town and stay with a friend, so I am available. Other emergencies, I might not be. Meg's group brought up the training as first responders, and our 2 facilities managers are trained as first responders. And also all of us on the Health and Safety Committee were trained as CERT members. So that's Community Emergency Response Teams. We are the university, one of the university's community emergency response teams. I will say our museum is on the campus of the University of Florida. So we get a lot of good training through the university. And one of the things that I discovered when we had those hurricanes back in 2004, 3, whatever it was, one of our facilities on Pine Island, which is off of Fort Myers, received heavy damage. So a group of us went down to do the recovery. Of course, there was no power. It was very hot. It was in August. It was very hot and steamy. And because of my body type, I do not respond well to temperature changes. And so I discovered that I had a very difficult time being down there in that situation and working to full capacity. And so what I discovered is that I am not the right person in that situation to be on the recovery team. I am much better served as a manager or coordinator working offsite. So, you know, that's something I didn't know about myself and something that I discovered. So that's another way of once you've been through emergency, reassessing your teams, figuring out who might be the best person to be on the teams and who might not based on their experiences. That's all I had comments about that.
That's a really great point, sort of reassessing things after you've been through it. I like that. I think that's important. We do want to open it back up for any additional questions that you may have. Again, just unmute yourself or type your question in the chat box. Anybody have any additional questions about either of these items or anything we've discussed or that you discussed in your breakout rooms?
I did want to say hello to Jean. I've worked with her quite a bit.
All right, I'm going to share my screen really quickly. If you still have a question, feel free to ask it and just interrupt me. But I just want to quickly thank you all for joining us today. Remind you that we are going to be sending out a survey. It's very short. Please take just a few minutes to fill that out for us. It really helps us understand what you thought about our program and what kinds of things you'd like to see us manage in the future. The next 3 programs that we have in this series are really focused more on the response piece. So we've talked a lot about the preparation. So the next one is Salvage Priorities and Techniques on February 18th. And then March 11th and 25th are tabletop exercises where we're encouraging you to bring other people in your museum to sign up kind of together, whether that's volunteers who help out or other people on your team, and to kind of go through some of these emergency scenarios in real time, how you would respond as your organization. If you can't join with your organization, we will try and put you together with like organizations for those 2. And then we have some diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility programs that we're developing April through June. Please take a look at our website, flamuseums.org, or you can follow our Twitter or Facebook at FLA Museums is our handle. Also on our Facebook, we do have a private group that you can request to join. And this is where colleagues kind of share information with each other. And you can kind of ask any question that you want or share information. And it's really a great way to sort of get your questions answered in real time. Any additional questions or final thoughts, Elise?
I just wanted to say again, please feel free to contact me if you have questions, you want more information, or you just need some advice or just need to talk through some issues. If you want to call, I'm not at work right now. I'm in Maryland still with my family, but I will be back in February. My full information is available on the Florida Museum website. You go down from the homepage to staff directory, my phone number's there, and my email address, but I also put my email address in the chat box.
Yes, so go ahead and save the chat box now, and you'll have both my email and Elise's and all the resources. Somebody else had a question? I thought I heard somebody unmute. Okay, maybe not. All right, thank you all again so much for attending. Again, if you have any questions, follow up with Elise or I. I'll send you all an email, and I'll have our contact information in there as well. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.